Welcome back, everybody, to the Bible Search and Rescue podcast for the Westar Institute. Here at Bible Search and Rescue, we take some of our topics from our site and we like to expand on them with incredible guests. We have interviews, scholars. We do a variety of interactions with the people that help us make Bible Search and Rescue successful. And today we have an amazing interview lined up with our internationally renowned author, John Dominic Crossan. John Dominic Crossan was one of the co-chairs of the Jesus Seminar. And he is, for those of you who have been around for a minute or have read in critical scholarship, as mentioned, he's an internationally renowned author who did his doctorate at St. Patrick's College in Maynooth, which is the National Seminary for Ireland. His work has been translated into languages all across the globe. He's an incredible scholar who's written a number of volumes that have been actually very influential for me in my research over the years, including, I don't know if I ever told you this, Dom, I know for sure you came up in my PhD dissertation. And so your work has been instrumental in my life. And you have been one of the core members of Westar for several decades. And we're so happy to have you here as we talk about your new book. So how are you this morning?
I am fine, and thank you, Chad. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Absolute pleasure for us to have you, sir, especially when we get to talk about a new Crossan book. And for those tuning in here, Dom has a new book coming out. It appears we're targeting late June, it looks like. We have Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violence of Civilization. And with this, we are very excited because I actually had a chance to preview this book and read it through during the past week. Our podcast with Dom is going to be a two-parter starting today, where we're actually going to focus on sort of a preview of the book, talking about the contrast between Paul from his own letters, or what we might call the Pauline Paul, versus the Paul that appears in the book of Acts, which is the Lucan Paul. So let's jump into it. First of all, Dom, let's talk a little bit about what was the inspiration for doing this particular book?
Oh, let me think for a second. I've always been interested in Paul, but only because of Jesus. Let me be clear about that, because some people are totally interested in Paul. I'm not. I suppose, like Plato was interested in Socrates. Paul is interested in Jesus, and I take him at his word. I think of him as I was going to say a postscript, a footnote. That's not fair. But I'm interested in him as part of the historical Jesus. I really am, for two reasons. First of all, of course, people say, well, he betrayed the historical Jesus. Okay, I want to know that. If he did, then that'll tell me by looking at Paul what I should not see about Jesus. If he is this great proclaimer, then the more he says about Jesus, the more I understand about Jesus. But also, resurrection, crucifixion, let me take that back. Execution, for shock terms, execution and resurrection is the pivot for me from Jesus to Paul. And I disagree completely with historical Jesus scholars who stop at the tomb. You have to take a claim has been made about Jesus, no matter what you think about it. A claim has been made about Jesus, about resurrection or ascension. You have to face it. You have to say what you think about it as a historian. Why did they make it?
Yeah, well, and what's interesting, so we had a chance to actually meet for the first time in Salt Lake whenever we went and did the Westar conference in Salt Lake recently. And we talked briefly, it kind of reminds me of Jefferson with the Jefferson Bible. Jefferson's morals of Jesus ends at the tomb. He dies, he's buried, that's the end of the story. But you obviously go more in depth in this to talking about the issue of how resurrection and ascension play a role in Paul's understanding of this. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about the contrast of what Acts had to say about Paul versus Paul in his own letters, because obviously things like resurrection and ascension, they play a pivotal role in those various texts, but they don't always line up the same way. And so kind of let's dive in. Just tell me a little bit about what were your initial thoughts as you were going through and you were doing your comparisons between the letters of Paul and the book of Acts.
I knew, of course, that every major scholar I could think of says that when you are comparing, let's call it the Pauline Paul. By that I mean the Paul that we see in the 7 authentic historical letters. That's the Pauline Paul. And the Lucan Paul is the Paul of Luke Acts. And I will consistently say Luke Acts because I consider that to have been a single book designed, programmed, written, published as a single 2-volume work. Yep. The same way as Josephus's Against Appian, Contra Appian is a 2-volume work. And that's simply logistics. If you want to write, say, 36,000 words on a single scroll, good luck. It'll probably take 2. Classic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, John, they can fit into 1 scroll. You want to write what Luke wanted to write, you're going to require 2 scrolls. So let me presume that. All right, everyone says it. Everyone agrees. Priority is given to the Pauline Paul over the Lucan Paul. Having said that, and having ushered the Lucan Paul politely out the front door, he comes back in through the back door. He oozes through the bricks. He comes down the chimney like Santa Claus. You can't get rid of him. The reason is very clear. The best teller of tales in the New Testament after Jesus, the parabler, is Luke, the author. I'm using that as the conventional term. Whoever is the author of Luke Acts. Nobody tells a story like him except Jesus. But remember, Jesus's parables were fiction. The fact that it's a magnificently seductive story doesn't make it history. It may, of course. But what we have to face is this. What I did actually, when I began to think about Paul, is I decided to leave Paul aside almost and focus on Luke, and especially on Luke Acts. Try to get inside the mind of Luke Acts. What's going on? What does this person want to do? And how does this fictionalized picture of Paul fit into his program? So you have to get the program first. What is Luke Acts up to in plain language? What's his authorial intention? What's his rhetorical? What's he up to in plain language? What's the purpose of this? What's his vision? Mm-hmm. So before you do Paul, I didn't want to do Paul and then dip in to Luke Acts as if it was a buffet. Like this, don't like that, take this, dump that. No, let me look at Luke Acts as if I'm totally interested in him. What's he up to? What's his vision? What's his purpose? And how does Jesus in the first volume, Peter and Paul in the second volume, because they're the apostles, Peter and Paul, how did they fit into his vision? I mean, it's nothing extraordinary. It's kind of a common way to do it respectfully. Then I'll have some idea when I think he's fictionalizing Paul and when he's giving me history about Paul before I even get to Paul. That's in a mouthful is what's going on.
Yeah, and did it extremely well. It's been a while since I read a Paul biography. And this is more than just a biography. It's an analysis of Paul and what Paul could mean for us today. And we'll get into that in part 2 of the podcast. But to kick it off, there are some things that, you mentioned that, first of all, the idea that Paul was not a convert. This isn't a conversion to Christ outside of Judaism. It's a vocation from Christ within Judaism. And that's a kind of a key piece of this that launches into it. Paul's not converting to Christianity. Paul is a Jewish person who has taken on what you call, and I really like this terminology, messianic Christic
Yeah.
is the term. Tell me a little bit about, where did you come up with the term Christic?
Well, first of all, the negative. Christianity doesn't exist yet, because when we talk about Judaism and Christianity, we're talking about very often separate religions.
Yeah.
We're talking now about people who were Jews and consider themselves Jews, and who might have said of other Jews, you guys don't get it. They consider themselves Jews. So what are we going to call them? They do believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Paul does, so does Matthew. Now, Messiah is simply the anglicized version of the Hebrew Aramaic word for the anointed one. Christus is the same. That's simply the Greek, the anglicized Greek of it. So I suddenly, it kind of got to me, you say Messiah Christ, but you wonder, want to say, so messianic stroke Christique. So for that period, that short period, or whenever it was, any person who says, I am a Jew, but I believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah Christ, I'm going to call that person a messianic Christic. I'll use it as an adjective. I'll use it as a noun. I say there were messianic Christians in the 40s and 50s. Paul was a messianic Christique. I know I'm creating a new word, but we need it, because it's not enough to go around saying Paul wasn't a Christian. Well, if we're talking about today, then he wasn't a Jew either. He was that period when there was a new phenomenon, or as he might say, a new creation, and messianic Christic. So the language in this place is important, actually, for me.
Yeah, and it makes tremendous sense when reading the book as to how this all comes together. And something to keep in mind for those who will be reading this, it's not just about the differences. So Dom goes through it and he starts by talking about a number of the areas in which there is agreement between Luke Acts and the Pauline Paul. And so maybe let's just touch on that for a second. What were some of the areas of agreement that you find between Paul's own letters and the Luke Acts saga?
Well, one that jumps out immediately, of course, is that Paul was a Jew, just in case it's necessary to say that. Secondly, that Paul was a Pharisee. I'm talking now about agreements. Paul says it, Luke Acts says it. So he was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He was a persecutor. Now, those are three very powerful things that we know about him. Now, the fourth one is where the crutch is. Was he or was he not an apostle? And of course, this is what Paul lives and dies for. This is his authority. This is his integrity. Now, the question is, this is the core of the difference. And in one sense, it's the only one worth arguing about. There's other difference, like was he a Roman citizen? You could argue. I don't think he was. Luke says he was. Was he from Tarsus? Well, probably was, because I can't see any reason why Luke would make that one up. If he said he was from Alexandria or Athens, I'd have some kind of skepticism. He's upping his resume a bit, like he does regularly. But Tarsus, unless we find something, unless we find out, say, that the author of Luke Acts was from Tarsus, maybe, I have no reason to debate that. So I'm not going to debate the minor details. But the core one is apostle. And that comes down to, was he on a par with Peter? And that's where now the rubber hits the road, as it were, for Paul. And that's maybe what we want to talk about. Because there are other things, by the way, I take. It's not that I distrust everything at all that Luke says about, that Luke Acts says about Paul. But let me give you an example just to jump into it. Both Luke Acts has very good information about Paul. Some scholars think he may even know the epistles. I wouldn't debate that. Maybe he does. He doesn't understand them, but lots of people don't. I think he knows the places Paul was, and he knows some sequences. Now, whether he knows what happened there is another question, but he knows stuff. He's not making it all up like you might in the 4th century say, make up a biography of Paul. He knows stuff. It's the interpretation we're debating. For example, Paul says that famous story about his exit strategy from Damascus through the window in a basket. How can you forget it? Luke knows it too. But Paul says it because he did it because the Nabateans were trying to arrest him, which makes absolute historical sense around the year 36. And Luke says it because the Jews wanted to kill him. Okay, now, that's an important point. The Jews did not guard the gates of Arab cities in the 1st century. Okay, we let that hang there. And this goes along with something about Luke. Be very, very careful about reading Luke Acts about the Jews. Really. Because Luke is the first great step in the separation. You can argue when it happened, but Luke is the first great step. Anyone reading that would say, wow, these Christians are, let me say these Messianic Christians, I use that term, or whatever. Well, Luke would probably say these Christians, they're nice people. But the Jews, they're rioting and they're trying to kill Jesus, trying to kill. The picture is part of Luke's apologetics, pro Christiana. And that's part of understanding, as I said, what Luke is up to before you get into it.
Yeah, and that's something that really stands out. And it's an ongoing issue that we see in the New Testament. The issue of how the Jewish people, John has been one of the most famous that's been talked about with his use of the Jews. But you really bring that out brilliantly in the Luke Acts saga, the way that there's those shifts from Paul's own writing to now you've got in the book of Acts, Paul is trying to flee from the Jews who continue to pop up like a narrative device throughout, always causing trouble, always raising issues. Let me ask you this. When we have this agreement that Paul is a persecutor, what do you think persecutor meant to Paul and or Luke Acts?
All right. They both say he was zealous. And that could be a red herring because in the Bible, of course, zeal could mean kill. Could mean I kill you. I mean, in other words, if I Paul, I'm a persecutor, can I kill you? Well, no matter what he might think about it, the answer to that is no, because the Romans had a monopoly of killing in the 1st century. And if Paul had been killing people, no, assassinating people or lynching people, no, the Romans would not have accepted that. So no, I don't think we're talking about. I imagine Paul, let me give you the conclusion. I imagine Paul in Damascus. If I start with Tarsus, by the way, as the birthplace of Paul, the smart young Jewish boy, I think he is sent to Damascus, not to Jerusalem. That's like saying if I want to burnish my reputation, I went to Harvard. I didn't. And I don't want to burnish my reputation by saying it, by the way. But if I did, I would choose probably a place like that. So Jerusalem. For Luke Acts, everything begins from Jerusalem. First volume ends there. Second volume starts there. That's the pivot. So Paul, for Luke Acts, is the great persecutor in Jerusalem before he gets his rendition papers to go to Damascus. Luke himself says quite clearly that Paul persecuted in Jerusalem under high priestly authority. Okay, I leave that aside. Okay, now I'm imagining Paul something like the rather right-wing theological, ideological, traditional enforcer in the Damascus synagogue. Whether he's self-appointed or officially appointed, I'm going to leave open. I suspect self-appointed. I think he is the ideological enforcer. What could he do? Supposing he runs into these weirdos from his point of view who think that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah Christ. He runs them out of the synagogue. Now, that's not nothing, because that means, for example, if let's say I'm a 30-year-old male, I fall between worlds. I'm maybe not known or have standing in the social world of Damascus outside, and inside, I've fallen between worlds. I may not be able economically to survive. So it's not nothing. It's a little bit like today, if you were being fired by some kind of a right-wing organization and were only known within it, you might not be able to get a job.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, there's ways of reducing a person very heavily without killing them. So
Yeah.
that's the way I see him. And then enforcer, an ideological enforcer or a traditional enforcer within the Damascus synagogue.
This is, I think, the biggest thing that stood out to me about the section on the comparison between Luke, Acts, and Paul. Almost every Paul biography I've read over the years, and it's been a lot in years of teaching on Paul in various settings, has always placed Paul at some point in Jerusalem. And my takeaway from the book here is that what you're saying is that is a Luke Acts invention. Paul did not grow up in Jerusalem. He did not study in Jerusalem to become a Pharisee. He was rooted firmly in Damascus during the time that he was, whatever period of upbringing that from when he came to Tarsus. Is that accurate?
That is right. And that means, of course, that there were Pharisees in Damascus already. I mean, you can actually see the texts within Luke Acts that claim, Paul's speaking actually, it's Paul who says it, that he persecuted under high priestly authority in Jerusalem and had done so well that they gave him, as I said, his rendition papers to go to Damascus and bring them back from Damascus, which of course is totally unhistorical. The high priest had no such authority across Roman provinces, or to bring somebody back. Of course, it couldn't be done. I mean, not by any official authority. What could be done illegally is another question, but no. And then when Paul says, when he goes to Jerusalem first time, he was unknown to them. Okay, if he's been persecuting there, you tend to know your persecutor. So Paul actually contradicts that. It's not just, I don't think it happened. Paul contradicts it. And when he goes up that first time, you remember he only stays 2 weeks about. So Paul contradicts it. And when he's describing what happened, he says, I returned to Damascus, as if you're supposed to know Damascus. I think Paul had his, let me call it his graduate education in Damascus and became a Pharisee. I don't know if he was a Pharisee in Tarsus. Maybe there were Pharisees in Tarsus already, but at least in Damascus, which was, of course, much closer in language and everything else, in Aramaic speaking language, to Jerusalem. But Luke's whole formatting of the 2 volumes and his theological vision is that the Holy Spirit comes on Jesus. We call it the baptism in the first volume, takes all the way up to Jerusalem. First volume ends in Jerusalem, waiting. Then the Holy Spirit comes down, we call it Pentecost, on the apostles, and off they go westward towards the ends of the earth, which is Rome, the center of the earth. So if I'm writing, everything important starts in Jerusalem. Peter starts in Jerusalem, of course, even before Paul. Paul starts in Jerusalem. So I understand and appreciate what Luke is saying, and on one level, he's right. Of course, Jerusalem is where it starts. Of course, goes out from. Yes, that's quite right. But whether, say, Paul started there, or Barnabas, the same question was up for Barnabas. Did Barnabas go straight from his native Cyprus to Antioch? Now, some of these can be a minor detail, maybe with Barnabas, but it's not a minor detail with Paul. Whether Paul started as a super persecutor in Jerusalem. And therefore, of course, that allows us to get to on the road to Damascus. Mm-hmm. It has to be in Jerusalem to go to Damascus. And that's what I'd like to emphasize a little bit, Chad, because that's become a cliche, a proverbial statement. We could use that today. Somebody's had a Damascus experience, we say, meaning cataclysmic change, or on the road to Damascus. And I want to be very clear about this. I am not picking up Luke Acts, what I call its poetic license. If Luke Acts had simply located this great cataclysmic revelation vocation, I prefer to use that term, you could use a conversion as long as it's converting from a persecutor to a promoter. That's fair enough. But it's a revelation. It's a visionary revelation. Now, to locate that on a road is marvelous poetic license. Mm-hmm. Of course, he's going from A to B in terms of geography. He's going from A to B in terms of ideology and theology. If I was filming Paul, of course I want him on the road to Damascus. Yep. I don't want to have some kind of a vision I can't show. I wouldn't want to film Galatians 1 for Paul. I'd want to go with good old Luke Acts, of course. Now, I'm not criticizing for that. Good. That's good dramatic thing. But I want you to watch it. Paul insists against Peter, or with Peter side by side. I have seen the Lord. Have I not seen the Lord? We know that from 1 Corinthians 15. His whole dignity, authority, integrity, on a par with Peter and the others, is he has seen the Lord. Now let's take him on the road to Damascus. He's blinded by light. You don't see when you're blinded by light. It's dramatic, it's marvelous, it's unforgettable, but he doesn't see Christ. And furthermore, he doesn't even recognize him. He says, "Who are you?" This is not how you become an apostle. Mm-hmm. It may become how you become sort of a Christian. Maybe, they might well imagine themselves, if I'm getting baptized in the 1st century, I might say to myself, I am truly blinded. I am blinded. I do not see. And now I see. Of course, it's magnificent dramatics. But what it takes from Paul is the one thing that Paul lives and dies for. I am an apostle. Mm-hmm. And that's consistent. I mean, you can watch how Luke Acts consistently puts Peter and Paul. And that's why I hope to have this book published on June the 29th, which is the feast day of, watch the order, Peter and Paul. Nobody has ever said Paul and Peter. That goes back to good old Luke Acts. Peter is all capital letters and neon lights and fireworks going off. And then there's his sidekick, Paul, who's kind of like there, Sancho Pancho, he's also there.
I like that comparison. Yeah. And it's fascinating because for modern people, especially maybe living in the United States or Canada in more evangelical churches, many of these churches live in Paul, right? Like Paul is in many ways the centerpiece of the faith, in some regards, far more than Jesus, right? When you're talking about bringing someone to faith, we don't walk the gospel road, you do the Romans road. And this really comes out, and you actually had a great quote that I wrote down from page 65. You said, "The problem is that for his divine vocation, the Lucan Paul deviates most seriously and deliberately from the Pauline Paul by quietly questioning and subtly subverting his identity, authority, and integrity as, above all, apostle, and then necessarily as the apostle of the Gentiles." And that's significant because obviously what we see, Galatians, probably my favorite letter of Paul, because he is really fired up when he writes that letter. And he is coming after the Galatians in any questioning of his apostolic authority. My thought on this is from the very beginning of Acts. Acts basically, as you mentioned in the book, instantaneously eliminates Paul as an apostle. Could you talk a little bit about that and maybe what you perceive as the motivation for why Acts, the Luke Acts narrative did this with Paul?
Yeah. On a widescreen scenario, we know that the post-Pauline letters, for example, the post-Pauline letters are kind of anti-Pauline. They're trying to tone Paul down, but at least they admit he's an apostle. Now, the next stage after say, Colossians and Ephesians or Timothy and Titus is Luke Acts. He's not even an apostle. And as soon as you get, as you said, you open the story in the Acts, Judas is gone. So the 12 are now the 11, and we can't go on with the 11 because the 12 are the 12 patriarchs and everything. It's a sacred number. It's a symbolic number. You can't just lose one. So there has to be a new one. Now, everyone will make you think, they will say something like, God has revealed to us that another apostle is coming, and leave us hanging for Paul to fill it out. And by the way, in some of the iconography of the Eastern Church, Paul is shown, his bald head is recognizable as the 12th apostle, so that on either side, at the Last Supper, actually, you have Peter on one side with 6, and then Paul on the other side with the other 6, or at the Ascension. Paul is there with bald head and all, matching Peter. So basically, this case, what the author of Luke Acts says is we must choose a replacement for Judas, and he must be from among the men. He doesn't say anthropoi, he says andres, the males, proper translation. He must be among the males who have been with us since the time of John the Baptist. Kiss your apostleship goodbye, Paul. You don't fit in. You have to have been there. That's why Paul makes that offhand remark, if we have known Jesus in the flesh, we don't know him that anymore. So his vision, or their visions of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15 that he mentions, the whole list, that's what makes him equal to them. I'm just an apostle come lately, he admits. I'm the last, I'm the least. But if I'm the last and the least, I'm one of them. So this is to die for Paul. Take this away, and he's just a loudmouth.
Mm-hmm.
Or a loud writer.
Yeah. Well, and that the notion of de-radicalizing Paul really stands out because, so and for those who maybe aren't familiar with the idea of the various stages of Paul's letters, scholars have for quite some time disputed that all of the books in the New Testament attributed to Paul are actually Paul's. And so in particular, the pastoral epistles tend to be rejected wholesale by critical scholars as being later than Paul. And what Dom is discussing is the very idea that they were basically an attempt to maybe rewrite Paul. Is that the right way of saying it?
Yeah, I mean, rewrite. Sometimes when we were being taught this in the seminary, we were told, well, this is all right. There's like a Pauline school, and they're his disciples. And they're just saying, if Paul was here today, this is what he would say. But when you read what Paul said about it and what they're saying about it, you realize that's not what Paul said. And it would be a bit like if you said disciples of Martin Luther King decided to say, well, he was for nonviolence if it worked. No, I don't think that would be true to say of him. It wasn't, well, let's try this, and if it doesn't work, there's always something else. No, they are de-radicalizing Paul, because I'm going to call Paul the terror of the New Testament. He is the radicality of Jesus out across the Roman Empire. Jesus was kind of in the small hamlets of Galilee. When he took it to Jerusalem, he was killed. Paul is taking this out across the Roman Empire, Paul is not a liberal. Luke Acts is written by a liberal. He's a radical. He thinks that what is wrong with the world is not just, if it was a little kinder, gentler, everything would be lovely. He sees something profoundly wrong, manifested by Rome, but not created by Rome, and not exhausted by Rome. So that's very scary. So much of the New Testament wants to tone him down, and the way that it's done in the long term, if we're talking about 300 years, is Peter, Paul. We're back again to that. Peter is the dominant one. Because Peter, well, there's 2 letters attributed to him, I know, but Peter is not as radical. Peter is the one, I think, First Peter, who says, to obey and everything else. So if you read, for example, Peter is actually the one who at what we call the Jerusalem conference, and this will be Acts 15, he is the one who comes in and tells his story, Peter's story, about his conversion to accept the Gentiles. Peter's story. James says, we've heard from Peter. Now, Paul is in there too, along with Barnabas, but he doesn't get a verbatim quote. He just tells, and then James ignores him. So I'm going to say that throughout the Acts, Peter in capital letters and Paul in lowercase, 14 font and 10 font, as it were. You are told that Peter is much more important than Paul. And that goes to the long history that eventually you're going to see all those manifestations of Peter and Paul embracing one another. It's in the iconography of the first 3 centuries. But it's always, their arms are around one another, but if you look carefully, Peter's arms are around Paul. Oh yeah, Paul's arms are underneath, around Peter. But if you looked at it, in some cases, I know in Monreale Cathedral in Sicily, for example, the picture I have on the cover of the book, there's also a picture of them embracing. And the text says, I think, Paul comes to Rome and Peter embraces him, or something like that. It's quite clear who's in charge. Peter. And that's part of the program of Luke Acts. Peter's not so dangerous, not so, because he didn't write authentic letters himself. Maybe if he did, he'd be just as much trouble, but he didn't.
And you bring this up in Luke Acts. It's Peter who has the vision of the sheet falling from heaven with the unclean animals. There's this method in which Luke Acts is undercutting Paul throughout. And another quote that I really liked, the Paul of Luke Acts contradicts all 3 claims. Paul only heard but did not see Jesus. He was not called as an independent apostle, but as a dependent missionary. His mission was to both Jews and Gentiles, and not specifically for the latter. And that's a big point for Paul, because Paul says, have I not seen the Lord? And well, Luke Acts says, no, you didn't. You only heard voice, and you were blinded. You were unable to see him because you were blinded.
Yeah, if you were an independent person, let's say, and let's say, put it this way, a first century reader, you don't know anything about Paul, and you've never heard of Paul, and you're saying the beginning of the 2nd century, because that's when I date Luke Acts. You read Acts, just like an intelligent person. You'd say, well, as I see it, James certainly seems to be very, very much authoritative in this book. So whoever this guy, James of Jerusalem, is, he looks like to me like kind of the boss. Now, under him comes Peter. Peter is clearly very, very important. There's nothing in Acts 15 about a division like you get in Galatians, that Peter is in charge of the mission to the Jews, Paul is in charge of the mission to the Gentiles. Oh, that's not going to be in Acts 15. No way is that going to be mentioned. You'd come to a fair conclusion that Peter is the most important apostle, you might use that term, and everything that happens to Paul has happened to Peter first. Like, the miraculous breakout from prison happens to Paul, but it has happened to Peter already. You find out that there's 3 times you hear the story of Paul's great vocation or conversion to accept the Gentiles, if you want to use that term. When it happens, that would be in Acts 9, sorry. And when he tells it to his fellow Jews, Acts 22, when he tells it again to the Roman authorities, Acts 26. So you say, okay, 3 times we get this story. But wait a minute now. In Acts 10, we get it happening to Peter. Oh, that's after 9. So there's a gesture toward that looks towards history there. At least it happens to Paul in 9, happens to Peter in 10. But then Peter gets to repeat it to the apostles in 11, and he gets to repeat it again, I'm talking verbatim repeat, in 15. So you got 3 accounts of Paul's conversion to accept the Gentiles, let me use the term conversion, and 3 times Peter. So if you're reading this kind of neutrally and don't know anything about letters of Paul or anything else, just he's a guy in the story, you would conclude that Peter is certainly much more important. He opens the mission to the Gentiles. And you might conclude that Paul is important as a missionary, kind of under Peter, certainly under James. And he's sort of the long distance runner, you might say. Yeah. You don't quite know that Peter ever gets to Rome, because that's not in there. The last thing you hear about Peter is he went to some other place. But I think you'd come up with that Peter and Paul is right. Peter's the most important.
Let's talk a little bit about the end of Paul's life, because as you had mentioned earlier, you don't think that historically Paul was actually a Roman citizen. And so of course in Acts, he's a citizen, and he uses this sense of citizenship status that he can just appeal to Caesar, and every Roman citizen could just appeal to Caesar and go to Rome. Do you think that Paul did go to Rome, and did he die there? And what was the reason for him being in Rome, and what led to his death?
First of all, in answer to your question, the answer is yes. So that's simple. Look, in the apologetics, and that's the proper term for it, in the apologetics of Acts, the author has to get Paul to Rome because he knows he got to Rome. So he has to get him to Rome. And of course, that does suit his general thrust westward from Jerusalem to Rome. So that's fine. He's no problem with that. But he doesn't want to say he went there as a condemned prisoner and was executed. Because the whole thrust from the beginning of Acts is that it's safe to be a Roman Christian. Luke's great vision is the future, dear reader, does not belong to Jewish Christianity, but to Roman Christianity. Luke Acts is the first great step towards Constantine. And on the other side, Luke Acts is the only one in the whole New Testament who got it right. That is, in a way, the future was Roman Christianity, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
That was the future. And Luke Acts was crucial, not just the first steps, but on laying out the road, as it were. So now, no way can you go to end that story with Paul got to Rome and they executed him. That's not apologetics. The recipe for disaster, because as I see Luke at the beginning of the 2nd century, he's writing the counter narrative, not like Justin Martyr, who's writing a philosophical counter to the Romans. That's a philosophy. He understands that the way you counter, excuse me, the way you counter a narrative, the way you control the narrative is with a counter narrative. Did we think we invented that in the last few years? He has a counter narrative. And the narrative is the innocence, the perfect storm of innocence of this Messianic Christian community, consummated by Paul, who's so innocent that every Roman he meets says he is. Every official Roman who meets Jesus, actually, that would be Pilate, of course, and Herod Antipas, also for Luke, and the Roman soldier, the centurion beneath the cross, they all declare this man is innocent.
Yep.
So you need some villains then to say, well, if he was all innocent, why did you crucify him? Well, it was the Jews.
Yep.
Okay. Come to the end of the second volume, same pattern. Again, 3 Roman officials, the tribune in Jerusalem, Claudius Lysias, the Herod Agrippa II, and Festus, all declared him innocent. So why isn't he free? Well, because he demands exculpation at the imperial tribunal in Rome. Now, wait a minute. No governor would be allowed to send somebody to Rome under guard, which is expensive, and present them to the imperial, not to Caesar, but to the imperial court, and say, by the way, this guy is innocent. Please exculpate him. You'd be an ex-governor probably by the next morning. I mean, how would you do that?
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're declared innocent in all the lower courts, so you appeal to the Supreme Court in this country. They wouldn't even listen to you. They'd say you not only have no standing, you have no sense. So this is apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if this is apologetics, Paul goes to Rome as an indicted criminal to be executed. Why would he do that? Because he's so important? No. Think of the parallel with Ignatius of Antioch, which is the closest case we have, again at the beginning of the 2nd century. He is sent to Rome to the arena, to be put to death. He writes back to all sorts of other people except his own church. He doesn't write back to Antioch. Why? He writes 7 letters, but not to Antioch. He had caused trouble in Antioch that probably spilled out into the streets. But these new Messianic Christians, it's the same thing at Damascus, are causing trouble. Now, if I'm the governor of Syria at Antioch, why am I going to do with a troublemaker like that? I'm not going to have him executed because that causes more trouble for me. Send him to the imperial court. He'd be executed there, far from home, far from there. Everything will be quiet. Paul, when he arrived in Jerusalem, that's another whole question. I think he did arrive in Jerusalem, caused, and that's another whole question why, caused turmoil in the city. Not just a theological debate, as it were, but turmoil in the city. And if I'm the governor, my solution to somebody who causes turmoil is not to go after the Jews who Luke says caused it, but Paul. There was peace before he came. Paul came. There was not peace. Paul is the problem. That's the way the judge, any Roman would judge it.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't say, well, these bad Jews are coming against our nice, innocent Paul. No, that's not the way it would happen then or now. The troublemaker. And the Roman way of handling those who cause turmoil among the people, that's a Roman phrase. Turmoil among the people is they are executed. You don't round up their followers. You don't bother with that. So Paul, as I see it, was sent to Rome to be executed, and Paul was executed in Rome.
And you would imagine that he died by being put into with wild beasts.
I mean, if you wanted to think in 64, remember now this is guesswork.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Not even advanced guesswork. This is amateur guesswork. In 64, we have the Roman fire, and we know Nero accused, at least I think this is history. Nero accused the Christians, which means that Nero knew enough to separate Jews from Christians in 64, accused them and persecuted. Usually that's the term used. Now, was Paul in prison at the time? Did he simply die under the Nero's persecution? That's possible. Nero may have emptied the prisons.
Mm-hmm.
But the irony is that Paul may well have died in the arena, not among fellow Christians, but among fellow Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
The main source of the executions in the arena and are between the morning and the evening celebrations and quotation marks in those festive occasions was executions.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know, but
Right.
I would look at that image I have over there on beside Caesar. It's an image of Paul. It's from Serbia. So I remember, yeah, from Serbia. He's got scrolls. That's his legacy. The legacy is not. He's often shown holding the sword, as you know, and the
Mm-hmm.
sword means he was a Roman citizen and was executed by the sword. That is, I think, fiction. So his legacy is what he's holding in his left hand there, the scrolls. I don't know whether to push the count, but there's 10 scrolls there. So I don't know whether he's leaving out the pastorals or it's just a random number of scrolls or he's all the double things like Thessalonians, Corinthians, Timothy are all in one scroll. But that's his legacy.
Yeah.
He wrote and he got it down. If we didn't have his writings, Paul would be a minor character in the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah.
Peter might wonder a bit about it, or but we'd have to take it that the most important person is Peter, and there's this other person, Paul, who does get around, likes to travel apparently, and he gets to Rome, and that's all we could say. We don't know who he is. He'd be like some of the other characters, John Mark, or maybe even Barnabas. There would be important characters, but we couldn't do anything more with that. So I want to insist his legacy is the epistles,
Mm-hmm.
not the legend, shall we say.
Yeah. Well, and it brings up something important as well, because essentially maybe the way to put it is that Luke Acts, as well as other things that come into the letters, which we can talk about in part 2, essentially it's a containment device. It's a way to try to contain Paul.
Yes.
And to minimize some of that radicalization you're talking about. Yes. Acts very strategically does not include the way that Paul died, it seems.
Couldn't.
Yeah. And because I remember as a young student, I remember people making arguments like, well, Acts doesn't contain the death because the author didn't know about it at the time. It was so early. And I'm like, well, yeah, I don't know that that's the best argument. But from a strategic standpoint, if you're trying to Romanize Paul and create a more Roman Christic vision, eliminating the idea that Paul was executed by the empire does seem to put a great spin on the story, because he's in an apartment, people are visiting him. It all seems rather lovely at the end, and the whole process of his death just sort of vanishes from the equation.
And this is the one time the Roman Jews said, we've no problem with this guy. We have no reports about him. So that's important too, because you don't even have what you usually have, the local Jews wanting to kill him, even if the Romans don't. So it ends up, you would have to say, Paul is exculpated by the highest authority there is, the Roman emperor, and Paul, of course, carries, as it were, the Christian, in terms of Paul, vision with him. And I'd like to draw our attention to the very last word that Luke uses. In Greek, it's the last word. In English, it takes two words. In English, the last words of the acts are without hindrance. Single word in Greek, unhindered. That's the manifesto. It's like, here is Christianity. Christianity, I'm going to say now deliberately, has arrived in Rome. How is it? Unhindered.
Mhm.
And that links back, by the way, to an opening statement. If you read the opening statement in the first volume, that would be what we call the Gospel according to Luke. It's an extraordinary statement. Luke says, I have read all the other accounts that people have done, and they're very good, as it were, and I'm going to do another very good one. When you read that and slow down, and everyone is so admiring, it's an overture. Of course, it's an overture. But when you wrote your doctoral dissertation, or anyone does, you don't start off by saying, everyone did a very good job on this subject, so I'll do another good job on this subject. No, you have to say, well, they didn't understand this, or they missed that. Or so when this begins by saying, other people have done a very, very orderly account, and I'm going to do an orderly account. Here's what it says. I wrote it down because I knew this was going to come up. I'm going to do it now in Greek word order, that you may know concerning the things about which you have been instructed the truth. That's awkward English. We'd say that you may know the truth. No, that you may know concerning the things about which you have been instructed the truth. Now, the word there in Greek is asphalia. Okay? If you hear the word asphalia in Greek, what English word comes up? Asphalt. The word asphalia means security. It means safety, not just security, it means safety. That's what we think about asphalt, good and safe. Luke is writing this 2 volumes. He says, everyone had done this before, but what I'm going to do is tell you, dear Christians, that it's safe to be a Christian under the Roman Empire. It's safe. It's asphalia. The other time Luke uses asphalia, by the way, he uses it to mean secure. You're in prison. You're asphalia in prison. You're secure. So the last word of his prologue, and it is the last word, he holds it to climax it, is asphalia. Safe. Safety. And the last word of the whole thing is unhindered. Those are like not hinge words, bookends. Bookend words. So if you're starting into the 2nd century now, the Romans know who you are. Tacitus has got a story out there that there was this guy Christ and we crucified him, and doggone it, it's still around. Okay, that's the stories coming out. You guys are the followers of a crucified leader. That's not a very comforting story. Now, it's not as if all the Romans are out there reading and waiting for Luke Acts, but he is assuring Christians, and maybe very much, and I was going to say that's another whole thing. I would say very much God-fearers. We'll get back into that maybe again. It's safe to be a Christian because the future is Roman Christianity. Paul got to Rome and he was unhindered. Now, I am trying actually to be very respectful of Luke Acts. I want to know what he's up to. I don't care whether I like it or not. I can't dislike it because he's right. He is right that this great apologetical story will lead eventually to Roman Christianity. Now, I may not like Roman Christianity, but he's right. He's the only one in the whole New Testament that says, no, it's not going to stop tomorrow. It's not going to be over in my lifetime. No, the future is Rome, and we've got there unhindered. Now we're ready to be unhindered. He's ready for history. And he's right.
Yeah. And, I think for those of you interested in wondering about, first of all, get the book when it comes out because it's great. But second of all, I never, unless you're a kind of person who says that it's disrespectful to point out the realities of how these two books, these two sets, Luke Paul versus Pauline Paul, are different. If you need everything to be harmonized, there's really nothing disrespectful about it. It's taking the text at their face value, looking at them comparatively, and putting them into the framework of how these authors worked, right, and they operated. And it's brilliant, the way that Luke Acts structures all of this. As I think you're saying, it's a brilliant stroke from his perspective in putting all of this together, the way that he meshes the two stories, especially reading them together, not reading Luke and then let me read John and then let's read the Acts after that. When you read Luke Acts together, there's this full scale parallelism between Jesus, between Paul, the nature of how Peter's role plays into that. Beautifully structured narrative. And as long as you don't need everything to be exact history, then yeah, what you're saying is that he wrote a really brilliant piece of narrative that contained Paul in such a way that gives us that move towards Roman Christianity.
Yeah, you'd almost write across. If you had Luke Acts as a book, you could put a red slash across to say, "Who's afraid of the big bad Paul? Who's afraid of the big bad Paul?" It's all right. Let me use one example to underline that Luke started this from the very beginning. Critical scholarship accepts that Luke Acts, or the first volume of Luke Acts, we call the Gospel according to Luke, uses Paul as a major, uses Mark as a major source. Okay, now, when I start into Mark, it begins with Jesus after the overture of John the Baptist. It begins with Jesus having a marvelous day, a fantastic, marvelous first day, inaugural day at Capernaum. He goes into the synagogue, he teaches, everyone is amazed, he heals. He has a glorious day. Now, Luke knows that. He knows that story. What does he do with it? He takes it into Jesus at Nazareth, not at Capernaum. Jesus goes into the synagogue. Everything seems great. Jesus quotes Isaiah, knows enough, by the way, to find his way around a whole scroll of Isaiah. He can find his way to, I think it's what we call chapter 64.
Yep.
I don't know I'd want to have to do it beyond it. That I can do it when chapters and verses are there. Okay. Anyway, and he says, today this is fulfilled in your sight. Everything seems great. Then totally out of left field, Jesus pulls in two stories from the Old Testament where God seems to prefer Gentiles over Jews. I mean, you say, why would you provoke your audience like that?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know what happens. They take him out and try to kill him. After that, Jesus moves away and just goes right back on as if nothing happened. He's back in synagogues the next day and everything. That is Luke writing chapter 4 of his gospel, our terms now, in preparation for Paul.
Mm-hmm.
What Jesus does in the synagogue at Nazareth is a early distant warning of what Paul's going to do in Pisidian Antioch and Thessalonica, and all hell's going to break loose because he's going to bring in the Gentiles, physical Gentiles. So when I read chapter 4, it's almost like my poster case for Luke conceived this whole thing from the beginning as a 2-volume work and wrote it all the way through. And I could have to date it then the beginning of the 2nd century.
The amazing part for our listeners is that everything we've discussed here is basically just kind of a piece of the middle of the book that will be coming out hopefully on the 29th. This is just a part of it, because in the part 2 of this, after the book comes out, we'll start talking about the matrices of the text that you discuss. We'll be talking about the much bigger picture. This is just a sliver of what's actually in the book. And this is one of the reasons why, first of all, doing a 2-parter was almost essential, and we could do more than just 2 parts on it to discuss all this, but to also kind of help people to understand, like, there's a lot to engage with in this text. And once again, I've read a lot of your stuff over the years, yeah, and I know that this is not your first book on Paul, but you did a magnificent job of bringing some of these things out. And I look forward to the second part of the discussion, when we get to start talking about the bigger picture of what Paul might mean for us today, because I think that might be something that people will be very fascinated by.
And that's really what I'm after. The only reason I did so much and look, because I had to really get Paul back. There's no point in asking how Paul might be relevant today if I'm talking about the Luke and Paul. So it's really, I had to do 2 things. If you think of a double helix, as it were, of the DNA of Paul, one helix is get him clear of who he was. Thank you very much for your help, Luke Acts. I'll take what I can. And I do take important stuff from Luke Acts, by the way. But I'm very careful when it's not Paul. Then I really want to know, is Paul still relevant today, or is he simply did his job for the first century and give him honorable burial? He's done his job. Many people in the past have done it. We may all be in the same position someday. Fine. He's no longer relevant. Let's say it. Maybe he was relevant for the Reformation. Maybe he was relevant in the 17th century. Is he relevant for the 21st century? That's a valid question. And I don't want to be in the position of saying, well, he's in the New Testament and he takes up so much room in the New Testament. He exhausts all the oxygen in the New Testament. So we got to get him relevant. Let's try desperately to make him relevant. And the one thing that really did help me in that, kind of inspired me, is I noticed that European philosophers now, not theologians, were saying very often that Paul is relevant to today. They're treating him like a philosopher. All right, I'm not going to treat him as a philosopher, but if certain people who are outside Christianity and not speaking for Christianity find him relevant, maybe we should take another look.
And that's going to be a key part of whenever we reconvene and discuss this after the book comes out, which is going to be great. Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violence of Civilization by Dominic Crossan. We are hoping it comes out on June 29th or soon thereafter. But like I said, having read a copy of it thus far, excellent book. And it's definitely worth diving into. It's got some challenging things in it for us to look at and talking about what Paul means for today. Dom, thank you so much. It's been another excellent conversation with you.
Thank you, Chad. Until we meet again, I hope it will be soon and not like soon in the New Testament. Sometimes that's just 2,000 years.
No, we're gonna strive for something a lot closer to that when the book comes out. But thank you so much, and thank you everyone for tuning in to the Bible Search and Rescue podcast for the Westar Institute. We hope you enjoyed this, and until next time, take care, everybody. Thank you.